So in this lesson, we're going to take a look at running our application and taking a look at a few other features of our project that we have as well. So what we're going to use in our application and what's already available is this app use MVC. Now MVC is the framework that we're using, but this use MVC is effectively middleware. And middleware is the software that connects network-based requests generated by a client to the backend data the client is requesting. So this app use MVC sits in between our client request and our endpoints, our API endpoints. And this, as part of its job, routes our request to the correct controller. Now, if we take a brief look at the description of this particular method, it mentions about supporting attribute routing, and to add conventional routes use a different method. But we're going to be using attribute routing in our application. And what does that actually mean? Well, in our controllers folder that we were provided as part of our project, we have a sample controller called values controller. And if I open this and we take a look inside this controller, what we have at the top of this is a routes, which specifies API/controller. Now, when somebody is browsing to our application, they're going to be using http://localhost, and by default the Kestrel web server listens on port 5000. Now, in order to hit this particular controller, we would need to specify API, which matches the first part of the routes, and then we would need to specify controller, but they wouldn't specify square bracket controller close square bracket. It actually substitutes this controller for the first part of the name of the controller. So the name of this controller is called values controller. But a lot of what goes on in ASP.NET Core MVC is convention based. So the first part of this controller, the values, is what gets substituted in here. So in order to access this controller, we would specify http localhost API/values. And this would then allow MVC, when we use MVC, this would then route this particular request to this particular controller. Now inside the controller we have several different methods or actions inside the controller itself, and because our efforts are going to be to build a REST-based API, it's not going to be RESTful, we'll be a bit more pragmatic than that, but a REST API uses HTTP verbs to identify the action that it's going to return. So when a request comes in, it's the job of the framework to get us to this controller, and then once inside the controller it needs to match a particular action. Now if we were just to specify the URL just as it is here, then we're going to hit this particular method because it matches the routes that we're passing in. Let's say this is, for example, a GET request. Then it's going to match this particular route that we're passing in here, and it's going to match this method. So when we hit the API values, what we're going to get back is we're going to hit this method, and then we're going to return these values. And this is what we would see in our browser. Now, if the URL was /5, for example, then we wouldn't hit this method, but we would hit the next one, because this has HTTP GET followed by an ID. And this ID represents the next part of the URL, in this case /5. So our controller would see the request coming in, it would see the URL being passed in and would match with this particular method. Now there's different methods inside here, not all of them have code inside, but if for example this was a post, instead of a GET, then we would hit this particular method. And same as so on and so forth for these other actions down below. But none of these have any code in, so we're not going to worry about those. And we'll certainly be building our own controllers throughout this course. Now let's just check what else is going on inside this particular controller. First of all, we have some using statements at the top. Now these are different libraries that live inside the .NET Core framework, and they provide classes that we can use inside our code, which is one of the advantages of using a framework. You're not starting from scratch. You're using pre-built functionality to save a lot of the work. And this functionality comes from these different libraries that are part of the framework. Now, if we want to reference any of these libraries, we bring them in with these using statements, and then we can utilize the methods inside them inside our code. So for example, if I hover over action results, this is coming from the namespace microsoft.asp.NET Core.mvc, and we can see that using statement at the top here. So before we run our application, I just want to point out something else and where this configuration is set. How does our web server know to start on port 5000? Well, in our Solution Explorer, we also have a properties folder, and inside here is a launch settings.json file. And if we take a look in here, we have a few different profiles. The one that we're going to be using when we launch from the command line is going to be this one here. And we've got a few things in here that are not particularly relevant to us. The launch browser is going to be set to false. We don't want to launch a browser when we start up our API. This then becomes irrelevant because we're not actually launching a browser, so the launch URL we're not affected by. And we'll make one other small change as well. Because we're not at this stage redirecting to HTTPS, we'll just remove the application URL for this one, because if we don't, this will start listening on two ports, 5000 and 5001. But for the development of our application, we're just going to keep it as simple as we can until we don't have to keep it as simple as we can. So we'll stick to HTTP localhost 5000 for our application URL. And by default, we're going to start off in development mode. So let's go ahead and actually run our application. And one of the really cool things about Visual Studio Code is it comes with an integrated terminal. So I'll just close all these windows. And if we look at the background of this, then it tells us which commands we need to use to toggle the terminal. Now, on a Mac, by default, this is Control and apostrophe. So if I press Control apostrophe, this brings up the terminal window. And on a Windows computer, this would be a PowerShell window. But the commands that we use work in both a Mac or Windows exactly the same. Now, in order to run our application, we're going to use the .NET run command. And if we press return, this will go ahead and run our application. And it will launch the Kestrel web server and start our application on port 5000. And indeed it has. So let's go and visit localhost 5000 in our browser and see what's happening in there. So I'll just go to HTTP localhost 5000, press return, and we get nothing at all. But whilst Kestrel web server is listening on 5000, we don't have any routes listening just on on 5000 itself. We need to specify the root location. So in this case, it's API values. And we get returned the two values that we saw in our values controller. And if we go back briefly to VS Code and take a look, this is exactly what we would expect. These are the two values that are being returned. So if we add a value on, let's say we add value 5 for instance, then we're going to hit the second of these methods, and all we're going to return is the word value. So let's go and take a look, and if I add slash, doesn't really matter what it is because we don't have any actual code. All it's going to do is return value regardless of what we put in here. But we have hit the second method inside our API controller. Now if we go back into VS Code and we take a look inside a terminal window, we get a lot of logging information written out here, and if we take a look, we can spot some of the requests we've made. And the last one was an executing action method datingapp.api controllers values controller.get with argument 4565, which matches the value I put in the URL and validation state valid. But lots of logging information, and that's because we're running in, if I scroll up, we're running in development mode. And next we're going to take a look at how to set the environment and the different things that happen when running in different environments.